Long since its start in 2005, Vinland Saga had crept along as a fairly popular manga, but far from reaching the level of its contemporaries over the first decade and a half of its existence. Then, suddenly in 2019, it would explode into the zeitgeist through finally receiving its adaptation. The popularity of this manga, long brewing, reached its zenith and has now reached its end after 20 years of publication. But sometime after its initial burst of success with the anime, it seemed as if popular regard for it had lulled. You began to see praise and excitement among manga readers fizzle out over the course of a long stretch of the manga, in what might be dubbed Berserk Boat Syndrome, with almost the same story context. But to get into why the story seemed to drag its feet and how this fed into not a bad ending, but one which seemed to go in a whimper, we'll have to confront what the thesis of the story is and how it is developed through each arc. I will attempt to go arc by arc to explain the very question of this video: when did Vinland Saga lose the plot, and why? Suffice it to say that this will ultimately lead into some broader ideas about its thesis. Naturally, this will contain spoilers for the whole manga, so please view at your own discretion. To start with, most of the story doesn't actually take place in Vinland, but is centered around the idea of Vinland ascribed to the title. The principal character of Thors, who we start out with as an idol in the first arc, is someone who is constantly being defined by the look in his eyes. What he sees is this idea of Vinland, an indiscriminate love and a total, even innocent resignation towards war and violence. Vinland as a location is merely the soil upon which this idea is to be planted and grown, much in the same manner that the cycle of violence and war is likened. So, when I speak of Vinland, I am referring to this idea unless I specify it as the location. But in order for us to understand the development of this idea, we must know what it is in reaction to, and that is what the story portrays as the Vikings and their warrior culture. Thors pays dearly for his Viking past, and a young Thorfinn becomes enmeshed into the life of the Viking through his craving for revenge. Askeladd himself struggles with his dual nature. He actively emphasizes the brutality of the Vikings, which he detests and hates in himself, for the end goal of the preservation of his homeland, Wales. It's not quite a Vinland, seeing as he discriminates quite harshly between Viking and non-Viking, but it shows us the struggling duality our characters are saddled with. The man who does discover Vinland in this arc is Knut, with the look in his eyes being observed as the same as Thor's by Thorkell. Within this arc, we find everything by which the mangaka Yukimura wishes to identify with the Vikings. Honor, war and violence, and the romanticization thereof, slavery, patriarchy, and so on and so forth. This is not so much historical precedence as it is the author's own strawman, and he is free to make those associations, but more on this later. For now, let us confront the story within the author's world. Thorfinn's quest for revenge stems from the culture of honor which makes blood feuds a staple. Even later, he defends the necessity of this in order to punish murder, but his wish for Vinland is to create a world where this would not be a necessity. Furthermore, to use a sword only begets that cycle of violence which will leave one unsatisfied in the end, and this Thorfinn experiences firsthand. He talked of might making right, and it is this past which then proceeds to haunt him, but also grants him the deepest understanding of the situation. Someone else who reaches the same understanding is Knut. Knut is, at first, someone committed to non-violence, not out of a qualm for it per se, but under the idea that it would simply be best to do nothing. He's a prince under strict protection, so it is only befitting for him to stay as such. Then, we get perhaps the most important conversation in the series between him and the priest Willibald. Up to this point, Knut is a Christian. At least he is presented as such, and the person he was based off historically was as well. However, it is only through his conversation with Willibald that he comes to the understanding of indiscriminate love. This is the crux of the issue that the series wishes to address. It is exactly through discriminating in one's values towards people that one comes to violence in the name of plunder, might makes right, revenge, self-protection, and so on. Thorfinn himself starts in the name of revenge, and ends up upholding all the rest with it as part of such a cycle. Knut's realization of this is exactly what makes him have the same look as Thor's, that of a true warrior. It is exactly because he learns to view all indiscriminately that after the time skip, we are introduced to him poisoning his own brother to take control of the throne. Not merely an act of ends justifying the means, it is a statement of his resolve that all within his kingdom are equally treated towards the object of peace, whether they are family or not, whether they be executed or live. He has no regard for honor culture for the same reasons that Thorfinn will oppose it. He wishes to break down all men into equal subjugation to destroy this cycle. This is why he and Thorfinn become parallels. Thorfinn's realization does not come until Ketil's farm arc, however, where he spends a considerable time in the length of the time skip as a trauma-ridden slave in passivity. This is very similar to the state Knut was in before he came to his own individuation, though on the opposite end of the hierarchy. Thorkel even tells the both of them the same advice. The end goal and the motive is the same, but the method differs, and this means everything. Even the guilt and responsibility of it all haunts them, for Thorfinn in his nightmares and for Knut in his dead father. Both instances propel their stances further, as Knut makes peace with the curse of the crown by donning it, whereas Thorfinn wishes to bury the dead and enshrine them within Vinland. Thorfinn wishes to do away with violence altogether as a requisite of the end goal of peace. Knut wishes to save even the Vikings from themselves, where Thorfinn wishes to find a new land altogether without their necessity. This is the answer he finds to try and compel Arnheid to continue living as she embraces death after a life of loss. To cut the root of it, this cycle of violence and revenge to field new crops entirely. Arnheid still dies. His words and actions have but limited power. Knut is the most powerful man of their world, and he also demonstrates the limitations of his power. But the point at the end of this theme is that this does not nullify their effort. Thor's escaped to Iceland to find peace and was assailed by his past until death. But Thorfinn is able to build upon his legend under the same trials. All of this comes to its head in their meeting at chapter 98. That these two are foils to each other greater than any other character is established even from Yukimura's words. In Vinland Saga, multiple character developments parallel each other. I think you're talking about the characters Thorfinn and Knut. I feel very much connected to how Thorfinn would feel in this story, but I also don't want to project that only Thorfinn's way of life is the correct way of life. With this dichotomy established, there comes to be only one thing left for the both of them: to establish a Vinland, a land of peace, a heaven within the world. In another interview, Yukimura states this again outright, how Thorfinn does not have the power to change the system as it is, and so leaves it to Knut while he leaves to build a new country, outside of that system and Knut's grasp. But after Ketil's farm arc, where we have this resolution, there is an arc and a half before we come to the location of Vinland. The third arc of this series following Ketil's farm is the Eastern Expedition arc. From the outset, this is more or less a diversion. Broad adventures that the accumulating cast goes through, and at its best, a set of trials for Thorfinn's worldview. It also boasts an entertaining setup to its events: the war for power among the Jomsvikings between Floki, Thorkel, and Van, with Thorfinn caught up in the middle. Yet, for me, this arc ends up being where I think Vinland Saga loses the plot. It is by far the longest arc, coming at 66 chapters, with the Baltic War portion of it lasting for 36 of those. And it's not just that it's long, but it drags. There are certainly some parts which are quite memorable, but they are stuck in between a tangled together story which is at times meandering, other times rushed, and carried by an often awkward tone. Let's start from the top. I'm not going to summarize the arc in full or go over every single plot beat and critique them one by one, nor am I going to rely on nitpicking, and am concerned primarily with how the narrative carries itself, just as I was analyzing for the previous arcs. Anyway, from the beginning, Thorfinn and his crew are diverted to procure the means for their Vinland expedition for a deal they've made with Halfdan. Various circumstances increase their crew, all stemming from compassion on Thorfinn's part. They allow Gudrid on board for her own personal freedom, make a stop despite being pursued to search a destroyed village, and from this rescue Carly and a dog, and come to be acquainted with Hild. Hild acts as an extenuation of Thorfinn's past of vengeance and might-fueled violence which he seeks to redeem for his Vinland project. She is a sort of super-ego ready to terminate him as soon as these instincts come flaring back up in him, which is most especially relevant when he comes to face Floki, knowing him to be behind Thor's death. Besides this though, she becomes rather repetitive as a character, and virtually exists to bail Thorfinn out in most practical situations, but more on that later. Now, being a diversion from the location of Vinland isn't inherently bad, since the past two arcs haven't taken place there either, but deal with the idea of it. But this arc has the least to do with either of the two. As I stated before, it functions best as a set of trials Thorfinn must go through before he can settle Vinland. His rather awkward relationship with Halfdan, his dynamic with Hild, his struggle with Garm, and the material upside of his Viking past granting him a high position within the Jomsvikings. It only makes sense that we would see the positives of Thorfinn's past reputation also come to burden him. Garm acts as an inverted Thorkel. Indeed, people even gossip that he is some illegitimate child of Thorkel. He too wishes to fight Thorfinn because of his strength and desire to fight strong enemies. Only Thorkel does it for his own amusement and to win. Garm instead wishes to find an enemy strong enough to kill him. This obviously goes against Thorfinn's own principles to not kill ever again, as well as towards the wish of Hild to take her revenge should Thorfinn ever act to take another life. Such is the dilemma he forces onto Thorfinn. His encounter with Floki also ignites this trial, but on a more personal level. It must be said that Thorfinn is intended as the true hero of the story and aligns closest with Yukimura's sentiments. The location of Vinland and the idea are melded with his expedition. Yukimura certainly does paint Thorfinn's path of redemption as being an arduous one. However, it becomes increasingly clear how much is written in his favor even when assuming the worst-case scenarios. Thorfinn alone is one of the strongest characters in the series, if not perhaps the strongest. Naturally, this strength is limited by its scope as Canute demonstrated with himself, but he also has the power of friendship. Cooperation and community was always a necessity of the plot. After all, the objective is to create a settlement. But there is much in the way of this that skews itself towards Thorfinn. In the times where Thorfinn does appear to be in danger, there is Hild there to save him. She even helps others in sticky situations under the same pretense. The rest of the cast are also thrust into it, but their contribution will often be comedic or not really emphasized all that much. The most that does happen is Leif taking an arrow and being put to bed with no danger to his life. Sigurd is also injured by 4 arrows and practically recovers in a couple of chapters, which will become a steadily recurring episode. In general, this arc of war feels limp in effectively portraying danger to our main cast, something buttressed by the much lighter tone. Sigurd and his friend spend a chapter and a half talking through barrels, getting caught by farting. Actually, the second time within a couple of chapters that farting is used as a joke for being caught, and defeating their enemies by doing a barrel blast. When Floki is finally caught up to by Thorkel, complete with a bleak film reference, he saves himself by the sudden deus ex machina of Ymir, some yeti creature that Torkel tussles with for a while and then becomes irrelevant. Guardsmen are easily distracted and others left behind engage in a punchline of,
he's right behind me, isn't he?
All of this and more taking place within the most intense part of this arc. A war between all the most powerful Vikings of that era, which contrasts sharply in tone. Next to it sit detailed pictures of this carnage and occasional vignettes of the common warriors within it. Indeed, it almost feels entirely separate from our main characters despite everything. They're so well protected. The most consequential thing from this part of the story is his encounter with Floki, which ends in him once and for all breaking his sword, a symbol which will rather explicitly carry itself within the next arc, by which the sword comes to stand for the cycle of violence, and so its existence is banned for Vinland. Instances such as these constitute brief returns of form in an otherwise shallow pool of filler, so I believe I can answer definitively for myself that Vinland Saga lost the plot at about chapter 123. So how about when they actually make it to Vinland? That's going back on track, isn't it? Well, yes, but unfortunately the plot doesn't feel like it has thematically developed to a sufficient degree by this point. At some point, the theming stalls, but the story lurches forward. In my opinion, this comes from the result of something more fundamental to the setting that the author did not interrogate. I am not so concerned for historical accuracy in this instance per se. Vinland Saga is its own story, and so even as it involves historical characters and the broad strokes of events, it is free to interpret those as the author sees fit, seeing as it is historical fiction. However, what might be said to be the laxity of the cultural depictions becomes more strained when reading between the source materials, the manga itself, and the mangaka's own interviews. For one, Leif Erikson and Thorfinn Karlsefni, the historical persons, were both Christian and they both owned slaves. In fact, the latter, Thorfinn, is attested to have brought slaves with him to Vinland for the purposes of scouting. Obviously, this is the complete opposite case in Vinland Saga, as Vinland here is to be a place without slavery, and Thorfinn is explicitly stated to not be a Christian. Now, one is free to use a historical person and write freely their own story based on the mere tale of adventure that personage engenders, so on its face, this discrepancy is moot. However, combined with his portrayal of the Vikings and the setting at large in his particular way, it comes across as a curious departure. For example, bookending one of his own volumes, he talks about how a series of children's books, Vicky Viking, inspired him, ending off with the theme, "There's no need to assume that a Viking must bravely sail and pillage to be a Viking. Real, just truths do not always align with cultural assumptions." Well, unfortunately, the real just truth is that to bravely sail and pillage is the verifiable definition of the word Viking. Literally speaking, a popular theory of etymology is that it comes from the Old Norse Vik, meaning inlet, something acknowledged in another volume by Yukimura himself. A more academically trusted definition would be from the Old Norse Vika, meaning sea mile. But to stop there would be wholly disingenuous, because the Vikings were not a people. It was simply said that one would go a Viking, which means to go raiding. Viking as a word always came to mean raider or pirate. It was an occupation. The majority of people who took part in this were of course the Scandinavians, the Norse, the Danes. The Vikings were just a small, though important part of that, while most Norse were farmers, merchants, and fishermen. So to make such an assertion as one does here is quite odd, but it does give precedence for how the Vikings are built up as a strawman within the manga, not so much approaching them on their own terms as they were historically, which would have allowed for a more interesting dynamic, and could have better filled in the gaps when the story itself began flagging. Another instance, and one that was always odd to me, Yukimura in his interviews and volume notes will emphasize, though not without some distance, the importance of religion, particularly Christianity within his setting. He states in one interview, "I approach the Bible out of personal interest rather than religious conviction. I found its message of love and forgiveness truly remarkable. I believe that the spread of Christianity at the time may have helped ease the warrior mindset." In another interview, he goes even further on the discussion of religion in the manga, talking about how although he doesn't subscribe to any particular creed, he likes religion, and that religious worldviews of the era would have a major influence on how the characters think. Speaking of how we can learn some things from these religions as ways of understanding ourselves, and that he can depict characters whose thinking deviated from them, particularly true for the main character, Thorfinn and Thors. Now, the most direct sense of theology comes in Canute's discussion with the priest Willibald, which ends in Canute, hitherto a Christian, rejecting God. He even confirms this later by phrasing his actions as a rebellion against God. The other direct reference comes from Thorfinn, listening in on Snake reading Matthew 5:43-48, the same scene in which Thorfinn is stated to not be a Christian. There is one part in which Van wonders if Thorfinn and the others are Christian monks, for caring about people other than their family. Besides these, religion plays only in the background. The discrepancy between how he speaks of Christianity in interviews and how it actually factors in the story is curious, and it is something woefully underexplored that doesn't find expression beyond these few instances in the manga. All of what I scrutinize here is not extraneous. Yukimura speaks ceaselessly about the research he has done into the culture and era, and how that has factored well into his creation of this manga. Indeed, it is clear that he has put great attention to detail on his backgrounds, clothing, locations, and so on. So why does it falter at these important points in particular? It goes back to what I said before, that Viking culture is, for the story, a straw man for the author. Against this we have, of course, our protagonist Thorfinn, who acts according to our worldview closer to us than it is to the era he is supposed to be a part of. It is even admitted as such in that previous interview. Their thinking may seem normal to someone with the sensibilities of a modern person, but against this background, I can show readers that they actually had some unique ideas for the time. This ties to another part of his volume notes, on how among the Vikings, there was no guilt or doubt about the strong enslaving, subordinating, selling, or killing the weak. That was just the culture they lived in. So how did the kind-hearted live in such a culture? There must have been some who hated the meritocracy and the punishment of the weak. It must have been very painful to have such a large gap between the customs of society and one's own sensibilities. Only the strong leave their names in history, and so Vinland Saga is about a hypothetical minority who he admits has no historical basis. But it's historical fiction, so that is fine in itself. But if they did exist, as he also admits, they would in all likelihood be under the doctrine of Christianity. It was that which, according to him, helped ease the warrior mindset. That part is certainly debatable, but operating within his own mindset here, wouldn't that be something to explore that would challenge and evolve his own worldview while expanding upon the historical narrative? This and many other instances, for example how he portrays so simply a gender divide, show how Thorfinn comes to act as all too much a sort of power fantasy for the author rather than as a man of his era, and how much of this insertion of the author's biases affects the narrative in general. Yukimura does not interrogate this beyond what falls within his own conceptions. Instead, Canute rejects God to come to his building of a kingdom, and Thorfinn is at most only a little influenced by the Christianity of his time, but is primarily operating entirely to his own secular, quite modern pacifist viewpoints. So, in this way, they reflect the aspirations of the author and strangle the potential of the manga as a result. He even goes out of his way in 2 separate chapters to specifically attack and criticize the idea of an afterlife, namely Valhalla. In one chapter, a Viking is dying and awaits when he is to be carried off by the Valkyries, only to fade into darkness, hopeless when they do not arrive, and cursing his meaninglessness. In chapter 190, which interrupts the story to explain the backstory of one character's relation to Thorfinn, the author takes the time to also set up the scenario of Thorfinn logically assailing, with comedic flair, the idea of an afterlife. Again, Valhalla in particular. But it isn't as a criticism of it as something which begets a cycle of violence, which he does earlier too, but as a critique of faith itself. The idea is unprovable and the gods lie all the time. In the case of the unnamed soldier dying, it outright doesn't exist. Yet Thorfinn's Vinland is an unknown future which may not come to fruition, but is worth trying even if or after it fails. The only difference between the ideas is that one is in the afterlife and one is within this world. It goes just as Knut did with his resolution to create a kingdom within this world. Does this feel properly interrogated? Does the case of the afterlife and religion feel like it has been honored its place within the culture or given its due? Not at all to me. It simply comes off as smug and overwrought atheism. But neither does it feel that Thorfinn, within this story situation manufactured for him by the author, is able to satisfyingly interrogate the struggles of this worldview and its application when so much is set up in his favor. Yes, Vinland as a settlement fails. It has to fail because it did historically, and it would be too far-fetched to make it otherwise. It fails because of those who discriminated between their village and the others. Einar discriminates between the Arnheid village and the Inu, and so makes them his enemies. The same occurred almost one-to-one to him when the real Arnheid was attacked, where it was Thorfinn who stopped from going to revenge upon Kettle. Arnheid village cannot be saved, just as Arnheid himself couldn't, even under the impression of the idea Thorfinn promulgates. But it's about the effort. Yet even within this worst-case scenario and its admitted rushed nature, Thorfinn is ably protected. He remains the strongest character. Hild protects him the whole 2 arcs. He takes 6 arrows, including a poisoned one, and is back up and active within 6.5 days. Also to the rushness of this arc, the translation work goes from a strenuous and interesting effort into fully understood conversations between characters who don't speak a lick of each other's languages. You can maybe fill in the dots that it's supposed to be patched through their translator to some degree, but that's just the problem. It becomes a series of contrivances when it should be the most developed part of the manga as the finale. In chapter 218, while the last contingent of Inu are distracted and out in the open while killing one of their own, the villagers have their bows drawn and are stopped from violence by another person under the idea that it will end the truce. What would that matter if the last of their fighting force is killed then and there, as they were doing, and are aware of this fact? Characters outside of Thorfinn, and to some extent Einar, are thrown to the wayside. Knut, Garm, and Torkel are utterly absent even to the last chapter. Their absence is of course to be expected by some extent due to the nature of the arc, but we get no sort of resolution at the end either. This becomes the case for the other characters as well, from Gudrun to Hild to Cordelia, who seem to only exist within a direct relationship to Thorfinn and his ideal. The only exception being perhaps Einar, though his resolution is also rushed. But across all of these, with how subservient they are narratively to Thorfinn's idea of Vinland, it ends with it being framed as not Thorfinn's failures that result in the fall of Vinland, but of everyone failing Thorfinn. That there weren't enough people like Thorfinn. Yukimura stated in the last arc at some point he didn't know how it was all going to pan out, but that he'd try his best. At the least, the finale is able to end on its thematic note of the 1,000-year voyage suddenly introduced. Hild's forgiveness of Thorfinn was what allowed him to bury his demons and definitively pronounce Vinland fully melding as location and idea, beginning the aforementioned voyage towards a peaceful world, which is supposed to contrast with the bizarre visions the chieftain sees while in a trance, also part of that voyage, also pretty contrived. Yukimura stated that with this manga, he wished to create a new type of shonen hero who does not use violence to solve problems, even contrasting the typical protagonist as strongest in that they are the best at doing violence, between the characters who aren't skilled with violence are portrayed as weak. Someone more than a triumphant hero who's super cool in battle. This manga is his first attempt at this quote-unquote experiment, much as Vinland was the experiment of Thorfinn, but for me, it doesn't stick to the landing and flickers out. Was the experiment a success? The rough start of a new voyage for manga as he seems to have intended? Or was he weighed down and limited by his own preconceptions, dooming it himself? And with that concluding the essay, I would like to give special thanks to Luca Under Limit for helping with this video and its editing. Definitely check out his channel as he also does anime and other media analysis. And with that being said, thank you for watching.